All right, welcome back everyone. We are going to begin Lab 7, Spinal Cord and Spinal Nerves. Starting off, we're going to be looking at a cross-section of a vertebra. Really important thing that I want you guys to get really in the habit of doing first is identifying the front versus back end of this model. This right here is the spinous process of your vertebra, so this is going to be the posterior end versus the anterior end. And that's going to help you a lot with identifying a lot of the structures that we are about to go over. Starting off, we have a couple different grooves. We have the anterior median fissure, which is more anterior, and the posterior median sulcus. We have posterior, anterior, and lateral white columns and gray horns. The darker pieces that you can see right here are going to be our gray horns. That's all that gray matter, the processing part. The front, anterior gray horn, lateral gray horn, posterior gray horn, and then all this white matter on the outside of those, the anterior white columns, lateral white columns, and posterior white columns. The central canal is going to be this opening, or this canal running through the center, filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And another term you guys need to know is the gray commissure. That is this structure that's connecting the gray horns. So it's like this little piece of gray matter that's connecting those two sides. For your cervical and lumbar enlargements, the biggest thing you need to know there is that it's just a widening in these specific areas. So when you look at the models in lab, you'll see a widening in the cervical area and you'll see a widening in the lumbar area. And we will talk about conus medullaris in just a second. Now we're going to talk a little more about some of our support structures of our spinal cord, starting off with some of our spaces and some of our layers. Starting off with our epidural space, that's going to be all this fatty stuff right in here. Kind of a fun fact, when you get an epidural going through birth, this is where they often stick that needle, is in the epidural space. Next up is the Dura Mater, which is going to be just underneath or deep to that epidural space, is this little gray layer right here. Then you would have your subdural space, which is a space just underneath your Dura Mater. Then you have your arachnoid mater, which is going to be kind of more on the inside of this. Your subarachnoid space, and then your pia mater, which is going to be hugging your spinal cord. You have these structures called denticulate ligaments. These are sort of like cobwebs that anchor the spinal cord to the outer part. And then your filum terminal, which we'll get to in just a second as well. You have dorsal and ventral roots in your spinal cord. Dorsal is going to be more posterior for this, and ventral is going to be more anterior. I'll let you guys spend a little bit of time discovering that for yourself. But just to give you an idea, dorsal root and dorsal root ganglion are going to be in the back. Ganglion is a large cluster of cell bodies, and ventral root is going to be more anterior or more ventral. You have a couple plexuses that you guys need to know. The cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexus. The cervical plexus is spinal nerve C1 through C5. The brachial plexus is going to be C5 through T1. The lumbar plexus is going to be T12 through L4, and sacral plexus is going to be L4 through S4. So these are our plexuses that we ask you guys to learn. Next up, we're going to take a look at this model for quite some time. Starting off with our phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is going to be up here on top. Kind of looks like a wishbone, which you can see right here. So I think that really helps, is identifying this as a wishbone. We're going to jump into a couple other things that we've just skipped, starting off with our cervical and lumbar enlargements. It's these regions where you can see this begins to thicken, and then also down here in our lumbar region. We have our conus medullaris. towards the end of this giant widening, it kind of comes to a point or a cone. That's going to be our conus medullaris. This little filament coming down is going to be our filum terminale, and then our cauda equina is going to be all these little fibers kind of scattering off from there. Now we're going to talk for a little bit about our brachial plexus, but not too much. The brachial plexus has a lot going on in it. You guys have some slides in your PowerPoint that are incredibly helpful for this section, and I would really recommend learning a lot of that before you go into lab. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it today because learning about it from those PowerPoints is going to be really sufficient in order to get you ready for the hands-on experience. But we will spend a little bit of time talking about the spinal nerves and some of the trunks. The brachial plexus is C5, 6, 7, 8, and then thoracic nerve 1. You can't see it incredibly well on the right side of this model, but you can see it pretty well on the other side. So for example, C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1. So they just kind of go in order. These then come together, C5 and 6 fuse to form the superior trunk. C7 is kind of on its own. It'll just go to the middle trunk, and then C8 and T1 will fuse into the inferior trunk, which is below those two. And then you have a set of chords that you guys need to know. The lateral, medial, and posterior chord. Those will then be further subdivided into several different nerves that you guys are going to look in lab for yourself. Next up, we're going to have a conversation about some of the nerves that you guys are going to need to know kind of in the more inferior portion of this. Starting off with our femoral nerve, it's this giant nerve right here. Just lateral to it, we have the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve. We have the obturator nerve, which is just medial to the femoral nerve. Going more on the inside, this big one is the sciatic nerve. You guys might have heard this before, or this term before. Most people, as they get older, tend to have sciatic nerve issues. So it's this giant one, goes on the posterior end of the leg. And then you have your posterior femoral cutaneous nerve just down in here. Just posterior, kind of a little more medial to the sciatic nerve. And then another important one you guys need to know is the genitofemoral nerve, which is this wishbone looking nerve right here. So it looks like a wishbone. Your sciatic nerve will eventually differentiate into the tibial and common fibular nerves, but I will let you guys look in that in lab for yourselves, and the saphenous nerve as well. This is going to conclude our video for this week. Definitely spend lots of time looking at the PowerPoint for the brachial plexus this week. I think it's incredibly helpful for beginning to learn some of those structures. And as long as you feel pretty solid on those from the video, once you come into lab, I'm very confident that you're going to be able to jump right in, especially on the cadavers, for discovering these on your own. So good luck on your quiz and stuff this week, guys, and I will see you next week for your last lecture of the semester.